with you again this evening and study with you from the Word of God. We're in John, and of course last week we discussed John chapter 14, and you remember now in chapter 13 and 14, Jesus is in the upper room with his disciples. In chapter 13, we remember that they gathered there and had the last Passover meal, and the Lord's Supper was instituted. Jesus washed the disciples' feet, giving them a demonstration of true greatness is to serve one another and to love one another even as he had loved them. And then in John chapter 14, he knew their hearts were troubled, and he told them to believe in God and believe in him. And he said, "For in my Father's house are many mansions, and I will not, rather, if it were not so, I would have told you. I go to prepare a place for you. And if I go to prepare a place for you, I will come again to receive you unto myself." And he also revealed himself as the way, the truth, and the life, the way to God, the way to heaven, the truth personified. And so as we come to the close of chapter 14, I want you to notice the last verse in chapter 14 before we turn to chapter 15, because this verse is often overlooked by people, and I've read a number of books that have completely misunderstood and misapplied what happens in chapters 15 and 16 because they didn't read the last verse in chapter 14. So you notice in the last verse of chapter 14, verse 31, "But that the world may know that I love the Father, and as the Father gave me commandment, even so I do. Arise, and let us go from here." Now that means that at the end of chapter 14, they leave the upper room. And yet many commentaries miss that. In fact, I've heard a number of sermons through the years, and many believe that Jesus and the disciples are still in the upper room until you get to the end of chapter 17. But not according to this text. This text tells us that they leave the upper room at the end of chapter 14, and that's important because when we get to chapter 15, we're going to see that something happens which can be much better understood if we realize that they're no longer in the upper room. What are they doing? They're going back across the city and back across the Temple Mount, and then down the east side of the Temple Mount through the Kidron Valley, and they're on their way to the Garden of Gethsemane. Now, everybody realizes that this is what happens, but many, for example, don't think it happens yet. They think it's not until the end of chapter 17 that they leave, but we read here that they leave at the end of chapter 14. Now, why is that important? Because I want you to notice how chapter 15 begins. "I am the true vine, and my Father is the vine dresser," or husbandman, as some would translate it. "Every branch in me that does not bear fruit, he takes away, and every branch that bears fruit, he prunes it, that it may bear more fruit. You are already clean because of the word which I have spoken to you." All right. If you leave the upper room, and remember, in Jerusalem, the Temple Mount is on the eastern part of the city of Jerusalem. Once you go east beyond the Temple Mount, you're down in the Kidron Valley, and then when you cross over the brook of Kidron, then you go up the side of the Mount of Olives. And so the Temple Mount area dominates the whole eastern part of the city of Jerusalem. The Temple Mount was an artificial structure that was built by Herod the Great and his engineers. It was 1/3 of a mile long, and it was 1/5 of a mile wide. And from the pinnacle of the temple, there was a 200-foot drop down to the plaza below. Now, this means that almost all of the city of Jerusalem is west of the Temple Mount area. And in fact, archaeologists tell us that the part of Jerusalem that had upper rooms where the disciples could eat the Passover and have that last meal together was probably either in the western or southwestern part of the city of Jerusalem. All right? If you leave the western or southwestern part of the city of Jerusalem and you're on your way to the Garden of Gethsemane, and remember, he doesn't get to the Garden of Gethsemane until chapter 18. Now, if you're going from the west or southwestern part of Jerusalem toward the Garden of Gethsemane, you have to go across the Temple Mount and the courtyard of the temple, unless you're going to go way out of your way, way around, because that's a huge, huge structure that dominates the whole eastern part of the city, a third of a mile long. All right. I think, this is my reconstruction, but I think the New Testament will bear this out. I believe that they go out then at the end of chapter 14, and they're heading for the Garden of Gethsemane, and so they go right across the Temple Mount. There was a huge bridge that went right across from the western part of the city and the southwestern part of the city, right across the Temple Mount. And I think that they're in the courtyard of the temple when Jesus says, "I am the true vine, my Father is the husbandman." Now, some would suggest that what happened here is it's Passover and it's full moon, and Jesus simply looks out across the hills and he sees some vineyards out there in the hills beyond the city, and he points to them and he points out the fact that I am the true vine, not those vineyards you see out there. But I don't think that that's what's going on here at all. In fact, we know from Josephus, who was a first century Jewish historian. He was also a priest who lived in Jerusalem, and he wrote his histories in the latter part of the first century. Josephus tells us that on the facade of the temple, that huge structure that Herod the Great built, on the facade of the temple was a huge golden vine. It was solid gold, beaten gold, and on that huge golden vine, it would be higher than this roof. You see, huge, expensive golden vine. There were all of these grape clusters, also made of pure gold. A golden vine, branches and clusters of grapes. And I think that Jesus simply paused there in the presence of that great golden vine on the facade of the temple. And Jesus said, I am the true vine, the real vine, and my Father is the husbandman. And then he talks about the disciples as being the branches that bear fruit. So what is he talking about? What's the significance of this kind of statement? Well, all you have to do is go back in the Old Testament and you find that Israel, the nation of Israel, was called God's vine. A vine that God took out of Egypt and planted in the land of Canaan, which we would know as the land of Palestine or Israel today. That the nation was God's vine in the Old Testament. Let me just turn back. There are several passages in the Old Testament. Turn back with me to Psalm 80. This would be one of them. Isaiah chapter 5 would be another one. But I want you to see what is going on here in Psalm 80, and maybe that will help us to understand what Jesus is talking about here when he says, I am the true vine. All right, notice, let's just read it together. O give ear, shepherd of Israel, thou who dost lead Joseph like a flock. Thou who art enthroned above the cherubim. The cherubim were there in the temple. And remember, the wings of the cherubim were over the mercy seat, the ark of the covenant. So thou who art enthroned above the cherubim, shine forth. Before Ephraim and Benjamin and Manasseh, stir up thy power. O come and save us. O God, restore us. This implies that North Israel, you see, these are the northern tribes that he's talking about here. Joseph and Ephraim, Benjamin, Manasseh. These are tribes of what became North Israel. Remember, the kingdom split after the time of Solomon. You have a northern kingdom, 10 tribes in the north. You have 2 tribes in the south, the kingdom of Judah. This is a psalm that has to do with the northern kingdom of Israel. And evidently the northern kingdom of Israel, God's vineyard, God's vine, as we're going to see, had been carried off into Assyrian captivity. And so the psalmist here is pleading for God to restore us. O God, restore us and cause thy face to shine upon us, and we will be saved. See, in the latter part of verse 2, he said, O come and save us. Okay? O Lord God of hosts, how long wilt thou be angry with the prayer of thy people? Thou hast fed them with the bread of tears. Thou hast made them drink tears in large measure. Thou dost make us an object of contention to our neighbors, and our enemies laugh among themselves. You see, Israel has become the butt of every joke. The northern kingdom of Israel, once God's people, God's vineyard, God's nation, now they've been destroyed and carried off into Assyrian captivity. And this happened in 721 BC. And so the psalmist says, O God of hosts, restore us and cause thy face to shine upon us, and we will be saved. Now watch verse 8. Thou didst remove a vine from Egypt, and thou didst drive out the nations, and didst plant it, and thou didst clear the ground before it, and it took deep root and filled the land. That's talking about the land of Canaan. God brought the people out of Egypt and planted them in the land of Canaan. And they took deep root and filled the land. The mountains were covered with its shadow, and the cedars of God with its boughs. And it was sending out its branches to the sea, and its shoots to the river. The sea would be from the Mediterranean Sea to the river, the Euphrates River, which would be in what we would call northwestern Iraq today. Why hast thou broken down its hedges? That means its walls. The walls of Samaria, the capital of the northern kingdom, have been broken down, destroyed, so that all who pass that way pick its fruit. A boar from the forest eats it away, and whatever moves in the fields feeds on it. O God of hosts, turn again now, we beseech thee. Look down from heaven and see, and take care of this vine, even the shoot which thy right hand has planted, and on the son whom thou hast strengthened for thyself. Now you have two metaphors here. Israel is the vine that God planted, which has now been carried off into captivity. Israel is the Son of God. And he's praying here that God will strengthen his son once again and restore his son back to his previous life of blessing and service of God. Two big ideas, and both of them have to do with Israel. Now, Israel was the vine in the Old Testament, but Israel is also God's son. You remember that's what God told Moses in Exodus chapter 4, verses 22 and 23. God told Moses, you go and tell Pharaoh, Israel is my son, my firstborn son. Let my son go. See, Israel is God's son. In the book of Hosea, chapter 11 and verse 1, Hosea is preaching there, and it's about 5 minutes to midnight. It's not going to be long after Hosea's preaching that the war chariots of the Assyrians are going to rumble through the land, and they're going to devastate North Israel. And Hosea is calling upon his people, his wayward people, his disobedient people, his idolatrous people, rebellious people. God doesn't want to destroy them, but notice what God calls them. Hosea 11 and 1. When Israel was a child, I loved him, and out of Egypt I called my son. God's son is about to be destroyed and carried into captivity. God's vine is going to be ripped up and transplanted over into Assyria, a pagan land. Why? Because of their rebellion, disobedience, and idolatry. Now, when Jesus uses these expressions in the New Testament, and particularly in the Gospel of John, Jesus is saying that I am God's greater vine, the true vine, the real vine. And God sent me, planted me here in this land in order to bring salvation to the people so that the people could bear fruit, good fruit. You see, in the Old Testament, Israel brought forth bad fruit. That's the message of Isaiah chapter 5. He's also talking about what's going to happen to North Israel. Their fruit was bad. It was sour grapes, bitter grapes. But Jesus is saying, I am the true vine. My Father is the husbandman. And he talks about every branch in me that does not bear fruit, he takes it away. And every branch that bears fruit, he prunes it that it may bring forth more fruit. In other words, through Christ, the true vine, his disciples and his followers are going to bring forth the good fruit that God wanted Israel to bring forth in Old Testament time. But not only that, in the Old Testament, Israel was God's son. But now, in the New Testament, Jesus is not only the greater vine, Jesus is God's greater son. And so in the Gospel of John, over and over again, God so loved the world that he gave his one and only Son, that whoever believed in him should not perish but have everlasting life. So there's going to be life, there's going to be salvation, and there's going to be fruit bearing, and it's going to be good fruit through Christ, in contrast to what it was in the Old Testament under Israel. So Jesus is God's greater vine, and Jesus is God's greater son. All right, now notice what he says further here in verse 3. You are already clean because of the word which I have spoken to you. Abide in me, and I in you. As the branch cannot bear fruit of itself except it abides in the vine, so neither can you unless you abide in me. Now, this was the problem in the Old Testament. Israel wouldn't abide in God. Israel went off and worshiped other gods, went off into idolatry, was not content to abide with God and in God and enjoy the blessings of God and the salvation of God. They decided to do their own thing. They're going to go their own way, you see. And so Jesus is saying he wants his disciples to abide in him, the true vine. And as they do that, they're going to bear fruit. So, abide in me and I in you. As a branch cannot bear fruit of itself except it abides in the vine, so neither can you unless you abide in me. I am the vine, and you are the branches. And he who abides in me and I in him, he bears much fruit. For apart from me, you can do nothing. Israel had to learn that the hard way in the Old Testament. They thought by making their alliances with other nations around, the little nations around, would protect them. And also they ran down constantly to Egypt, trying to get Pharaoh to come up and pull their chestnuts out of the fire when the Assyrian army came. But all of these things failed. You see, they didn't trust in God to save them and deliver them. And so they did everything except trust in him and abide in him. And so Jesus is saying, you're helpless. You can do nothing unless you abide in me. And so salvation is not a bootstrap operation. It's not the idea that we can learn enough or do enough and save ourselves on the basis of our own knowledge, our own works, our own efforts. No. He says that fruit bearing comes as a result of abiding. He doesn't say that you must bear fruit in order to abide. He says if you abide, then you'll bear good fruit. Good fruit naturally comes from as the branch and as the cluster of grapes abides in the vine, it draws its life. It draws its hope. It draws its destiny. Good fruit. Where? From the life that is in the vine. And that's the way it is with us. That's the way it is with Christians today. That's what the Lord is trying to tell the disciples here. If we launch out on our own and we try to produce good fruit on our own, by our own efforts, we'll fail. Just like Israel failed in the long ago. And the reason I think he's saying this, Well, there's more than one reason, of course, but one big reason, let's put it this way, that he's telling them this is because Judas is a branch that has left the vine, you see. In chapter 13, Judas went out into the night in order to betray Christ, to sell him for 30 pieces of silver. He's going to do his own thing. He thinks he's going to cut his losses, you see, try to get what he can out of Jesus, because he was one of those who evidently expected Jesus to establish a political military kingdom and set up thrones, and all the disciples would be rich and wealthy and powerful. They'd sit on thrones, you see, along with Jesus. And here he's invested over 3 years of his life in this man Jesus, and Jesus is not going to use his miraculous power to do anything. He's had every opportunity to set up a political military kingdom, and yet he won't do it. He won't use his power in this way. You remember back in John chapter 6 when they saw the great miracle that he did there of multiplying the loaves and the fishes? They said, truly, this is the prophet who was to come into the world. And so they tried to take him by force and make him a king. John chapter 6, verse 15. What does he do? He goes off and hides himself in the mountains. He wouldn't have anything to do with political, military kingship. So Judas now had become so discouraged, and he thinks, well, I've invested 3.5 years of my life in this guy, and I'm not going to get anything out of it. No throne, no kingdom, no wealth, no prominence, no power. So I'll sell him. And so I'll get at least 30 pieces of silver for all my effort. So Judas is one of those branches that has left the vine. He didn't abide with Jesus. And so what's going to happen to him? Notice what we read further here in verse 6. If anyone does not abide in me, and that's, of course, Judas. If anyone does not abide in me, he is thrown away as a branch and dries up, and they gather them and cast them into the fire, and they are burned. Did you know that the wood of a grapevine is absolutely useless? There's nothing you can do with the wood of a grapevine except burn it. You can't even make a peg, drill a hole in the wall and put a peg of grapevine in the hole in the wall in order to hang a coat on it. Just flop down. In fact, that's what you read in the book of Ezekiel. Ezekiel talks about that. Ezekiel talks about how worthless a grapevine is. The only thing it's good for is to produce grapes. It's not good. It won't make a peg. It won't do it. You can't make furniture out of it. It's just no good. Now, when I was a boy, and I guess confession is good for the soul here. When I was a boy, my father was a chain smoker. And he would light one cigarette off of another all day long, a chain smoker. Well, you know how kids are. I thought, man, that must be something great, you know. But he wouldn't give me a cigarette. Oh, no, you can't smoke, you know. Don't you dare. Don't bother any of my cigarettes. He's going to smoke them, but I couldn't. Well, of course, kids don't understand that, see. So finally, someone told me, you know what? If you can't get a cigarette, you can go out and cut a piece of grapevine, and you can light it, and you can smoke it. So, hey, that's what we decided to do. Several of the kids in the neighborhood, we had grapevines, and we had grapes. So we went out and we got some grapevine. We cut it off and made it about as long as a cigarette, you know, and got some matches, and we lit up. And the first time I inhaled, you know what happened? I didn't just inhale smoke. I inhaled fire right down my throat. Fire. Just about burned. Oh, I thought I was going to die. Singed my throat, burned, coughing my head off. That was the worst thing I ever, you know. They said, now you got to be easy with that, because they told me, you know, you could do that. You could suck fire down your throat. Well, I thought, phooey, that doesn't make any sense. So I sucked some fire down my throat. By the way, just about that time, my father came around the corner, and he saw what we were doing. And I knew I was going to get a whipping on top of it, because I guarantee you my father knew how to apply the Board of Education. And he did many times when I was a boy growing up, and I deserved it. I'm not telling you I was innocent. I deserved it. But you know, that was one time he didn't whip me. I couldn't believe it. He didn't whip me. In fact, he just laughed and laughed and laughed. Here we're all choking and our throats are burning, and he just laughed and he went on in the house. And he just left us to, to suffer what we'd done. Well, I guarantee you, we didn't try to smoke any grapevines after that. We learned the hard way. But a grapevine is useless. It's good for nothing but to be burned up. And that's what Jesus said here. And you see, Judas is in the background here. They know that Judas has gone out into the night, but they don't know where he has gone yet. But later they'll realize and they'll understand what he was talking about here. Judas is one of those branches that didn't abide in the vine. And so it's good for nothing but to be burned up and cast into the fire. Or cast in the fire and then burned up. All right, so notice what he says further, verse 7. If you abide in me and my words abide in you, ask whatever you wish and it shall be done for you. By this is my Father glorified, that you bear much fruit and so prove to be my disciples. You see, discipleship is something that had to be demonstrated, it had to be proved. And you prove to be my disciples by bearing much fruit. And he's talking about good fruit now. The kind of fruit that would be produced by drawing upon the life and the blessings and the salvation that Jesus provides for his people as branches in the vine. Now, the reason I point out this in the beginning of the chapter is I'm going to have to skip over some passages here now. And I want us to go down a little further here. And I want us to notice in verse 16. We pick up the thought of the vine and the branches in verse 16. You did not choose me, but I chose you and appointed you that you should go and bear fruit. You see, he's still talking about bearing fruit and being branches that abide in the vine and bear fruit. And so he says, you did not choose me. The word choose here in the Greek is the word eklego. It's the word from which we get our word elect. You've probably heard of the elect and the non-elect. And Augustine talked a lot about that in the end of the 4th century, early 5th century. And then John Calvin talked a lot about that later on in the early 16th century. And many people have the idea that election is something that is arbitrary and unconditional. That the elect are those who were chosen by God from before the foundation of the world. And if you're one of the elect, you will be saved. Regardless of what you do, who you are, whether you bring forth good fruit or not, if you're one of the elect, you will be saved. Because along with this idea of election is the idea of the perseverance of the saints, as it was called, but the more common terminology would be once saved, always saved. The idea that God elected you from before the foundation of the world. If you're one of the elect, there's nothing you could do to be lost, even if you wanted to be lost. Likewise, they would also say that if you're one of the non-elect from before the foundation of the world, there's nothing you could do to become an elect person or to be saved. No matter how much you wanted to be saved, there's nothing you can do. In other words, man is totally helpless, and this election is unconditional and it's arbitrary to salvation or damnation. Now, that's really taught. I went to seminary many years ago in Southern California, and I had a professor in that seminary who not only believed that God predetermined from before the foundation of the world everyone who would be saved and everyone who would be lost, and the number was so fixed that it could not be added to or diminished from. If you're elected to be saved, you will be saved. If you're non-elect, you will be lost. No matter how much you might want to be saved, you can't be, because the number is so fixed, you can't add to it or diminish from. Well, he not only believed that, but he believed that everything you do, every decision you make, is predestined, predetermined by God from before the foundation of the world. Whether it's a good decision or a bad decision, whether it's righteousness or sin, it's all predetermined by God. And even though we think we have free will, we think that we can choose, yet he said that free will is just an illusion. You're really deceived because it's really just an illusion. You really don't have a choice in anything. Now, he gave an illustration like this in class. He said, if I had two pieces of pie here, a piece of apple pie and a piece of cherry pie, and I offered a piece of pie to each one of you, you might sit there in your seat and you might think in your mind, well, boy, that apple sure looks good. But on the other hand, wow, look at that cherry, And so you kind of go back and forth and you have a difficult time deciding. But then you finally decide, okay, I'm going to opt for the cherry. But another one said, no, I'm going to opt for the apple. He said, it's all an illusion. You don't even have a choice. God predetermined from before the foundation of the world whether you would choose the apple pie or the cherry pie, whichever the case may be. Now, that's what he actually taught, and that's what people believe today. And many of our people are scared to death of this whole doctrine of election. Actually, election is a wonderful doctrine. It's a biblical doctrine. Now, what people do with it isn't biblical, because, you see, people twist it and make it say something that it's really not saying. If we understand what it's saying here, I think we can all understand this, and there can be a great blessing. There's a blessing to us if we understand predestination and election. All right. Now, notice what Jesus said here in verse 16. You did not choose me, but I chose you and appointed you that you should go and bear fruit, and that your fruit should remain, and whatever you ask of the Father in my name, he may give to you. All right, when he says you did not choose me, what he's talking about here is Jesus made the prior choice. Jesus took the initiative. Jesus went and called the disciples. Long before the disciples were looking for Jesus, Jesus was looking for the disciples. And he went and he called Levi, you remember, from the seat of, he's a tax collector. And he called the disciples there by the sea, and he said, come and follow me, and I will make you fishers of men. So his was the prior choice. He elected them. He chose them. But that does not eliminate free will or free choice or decision, because they each one had to decide whether or not they were going to follow Jesus, whether or not they were going to be his disciples, whether or not they were going to accept his teaching and have faith in him and obey him. And that was a process of many decisions. In fact, if you read all of the Gospels, you find that Jesus called them more than once. They'd start out and they'd follow him for a little while, and then what did they do? They'd go back to their fishing boats and back to their nets. And then Jesus would come and call them again. And then they decide to follow him again. And finally, when you get clear over in Luke chapter 22, we didn't have time to notice that when we did the Passover, the last Passover meal. But in Luke chapter 22, this is where Jesus told Peter, he said, Peter, or Simon, Satan has desired to have you that he may sift you as wheat. But I prayed for you that your faith may not fail. And when you are converted, strengthen the brethren. When you're converted? Well, Peter was converted 3 years earlier than that. That's when Peter started following Jesus. That's when they were baptized. When many of these disciples turned away from John the Baptist and started following Jesus, but they were baptized. They were converted. What does conversion mean? It's a change. Well, they began to change. But hey, that changing process took time, and they had to continually be converted. You see, conversion is not something that just happens once in life. Our whole life is a process of conversion, of being transformed, of being changed into the likeness of Jesus. And so Jesus is saying to Peter there on the night before he was arrested in the shadow of the cross, Peter, when you're converted, you strengthen the brethren. So Jesus made the prior choice, but they then had to have faith, and their faith had to grow, and they had to obey the Lord. And many times they slipped and fell. Many times they disobeyed him. Many times they disappointed him. And even when he was arrested and taken away to be crucified, they all forsook him and fled. You see, man does have free will, and man can nullify his election if he's not careful. When Jesus said here, I elected you, you see, he's talking here to the apostles, and that includes Judas. Jesus elected Judas. Judas was one of those apostles who was elected, but what did he do? He nullified his election by betraying the Lord and selling him for 30 pieces of silver. He died in disobedience to God, and that was his choice. That was his decision. It wasn't something forced upon him by God from the foundation of the world. You see, that kind of view just makes every person into a pawn on the chessboard. It's the idea that God is just moving the pawns around like you would move the pawns, or what do you call them? The chess pieces. Yeah, whatever they. I'm not a chess player. My wife is. I'm a domino player. But anyway, so whatever the chess pieces are called, you just kind of move them around arbitrarily, you see, as though they have no choice, no decision. Is that what man is? Obviously not. Man is not, just a pawn on the chessboard. And so man does have the ability to decide and to choose. And even though the disciples chose to follow Jesus, many times they failed and faltered, and they had to be restored and brought back and continued to be converted over and over again. And ultimately they became faithful, and ultimately they brought forth good fruit. But Judas is one of those who didn't abide in the vine. And even though he was chosen, he was elect, he nullified his election, and he died in sin. Tragic death, apart from Christ, separate and apart from the vine, from the life-giving vine of Jesus. And so don't be confused about this idea of election. Let me read you another passage along this line. Turn over to Acts chapter 9, Acts chapter 9. This is where Saul of Tarsus met Jesus on the Damascus road. The Lord appeared to him, the risen Lord. And Saul had been his chief opponent. He was the chief persecutor of Christians. He was the one who arrested Christians and imprisoned them and cast his vote against them when they were being put to death. He voted the death penalty. Killing Christians, hated the name of Jesus. Saul of Tarsus. But he met Jesus on the Damascus road. And the Lord told him to go into the city of Damascus, and there it would be told him what he must do. And so the Lord then alerted Ananias. Ananias was a man who lived there in the city, and Ananias was afraid to go and talk to Saul because he'd heard about Saul's reputation in persecuting and killing Christians. And so he was afraid to go and see this man. But you notice here that the Lord said to him in verse 15, the Lord's talking now to Ananias, this disciple of Christ. The Lord said to him, go, for he is a chosen instrument of mine. And in the Greek, that's the word elect again. From the same word that's found over there where Jesus talks about, I have chosen you, my elect. Saul is also one of the Lord's elect. I have chosen, he is a chosen instrument, an elect instrument of mine to bear my name before the Gentiles and kings and the children of Israel. For I will show him how much he must suffer for my name's sake. So Ananias then went and he met Saul, and he laid his hands on him, and Saul received his sight again. He was blinded, you remember, and he was filled with the Spirit. And verse 18, it says that Saul arose and was baptized. Now, in Acts 22 and verse 16, Ananias is recorded there as saying, why now tarriest thou? Arise and be baptized and wash away your sins. You see, we either can nullify election or we can ratify it. And that's what Saul did here. Saul is an elect, chosen vessel of the Lord to bear his name before kings and governors and the Gentiles. But he obeys, he responds by faith and baptism, and his sins are washed away. And notice in Acts chapter 26, you see the story of Saul's conversion is told 3 times in the New Testament. It's told in Acts 9, Acts 22, and Acts 26. And in Acts 26, Paul is preaching here before King Agrippa and the Roman governor Festus, and he's talking about his past. In Acts 26 and verse 10, this is just what I did in Jerusalem. Not only did I lock up many of the saints in prison, having received authority from the chief priests, but also when they were being put to death, I cast my vote against them, and I punished them often in the synagogues. I tried to force them to blaspheme, being furiously enraged at them. I kept pursuing them even to foreign cities. While I was thus engaged, as I was journeying to Damascus with the authority and commission of the chief priests, at midday, O king, I saw on the way a light from heaven, brighter than the sun, shining all around me and those who were journeying with me. And when we had fallen to the ground, I heard a voice saying to me in Hebrew dialect, Saul, Saul, why are you persecuting me? It is hard for you to kick against the goads. To kick against the goad. The ox goad was a club, a long club, that had either a sharp nail or sharp pieces of bone in the end of that ox goad. And if an oxen got stubborn and wouldn't go, you'd hit him on the hind flank and he'd move. But some oxen would be so stubborn, instead of going when they were hit with the goad, they would kick back at the goad. Well, when you kick back at the goad, you're just hurting yourself, because you're just going to rip your hide wide open on those sharp pieces of bone or sharp pieces of metal. I mean, that's dumb to kick back at something that's going to hurt you. That's like a little child who decides he's going to punish mama for giving him a paddling. So the little child said, I'll show you, and he goes over and starts beating his head against the wall. He's going to punish mama by beating his head against the wall. Well, he's only hurting himself, you see. And that's what the oxen is doing. Stubborn, will not yield, and so it kicks back and it ends up hurting itself, just like the little child ends up hurting himself by trying to punish mama. Well, when Saul is killing Christians, evidently deep down in his heart, he knew what he was doing was wrong. But he couldn't prove it, you see. He lost a big debate with Stephen in the synagogue there in the latter part of Acts chapter 6. Stephen was debating with the power and authority, and that was the first argument that Saul ever lost, because he was Gamaliel's brightest student. He was one who never lost an argument, never lost a debate, but this time he couldn't handle this guy, because Stephen showed from the scriptures that Jesus was the Christ, the Son of God. Now, you can always tell who's losing an argument by who gets mad. And not only did Saul get mad, but all the rest of the Jews there in the synagogue got mad. What did they do? They dragged Stephen out, and they took him before the Sanhedrin. And Stephen made his great defense there in Acts chapter 7. And by the end of that defense, they were all so angry at him, they just dragged him out and they stoned him to death. And guess who was standing there holding the cloaks of those who stoned Stephen? Saul of Tarsus. Saul of Tarsus. Killing Christians, but inwardly tearing himself up spiritually and psychologically, because down deep in his heart, he probably thought, could it be possible that what these Christians are saying is true? You see, the first time in Saul's life, he could not disprove their arguments. because they argued from the Scripture, and he didn't know how to answer them. So he's like an oxen kicking back at the goat, tearing himself up mentally, spiritually, psychologically. There's a warfare going on in this man. And then suddenly he meets Jesus on the Damascus road, and Jesus says, "You're a chosen vessel, an elect vessel unto me, and I'm going to show you how much you have to suffer for my name's sake." And so, as you continue reading here in Acts 26, "And I said to him, 'Who art thou, Lord?' And the Lord said, 'I am Jesus, whom you are persecuting.'" Verse 15, verse 16, "But arise and stand on your feet. For this purpose I have appeared to you, to appoint you a minister and a witness, not only to the things which you have seen, but also the things which I shall appear to you, delivering you from the Jewish people and from the Gentiles." Watch this now. "To open their eyes, so that they may turn from darkness to light." Hey, man does have a choice. We have a decision. People can turn from darkness to light. It's a matter of our will, whether we will to do that or not. "To turn them from darkness to light, from the dominion of Satan to God, in order that they may receive the forgiveness of sins and an inheritance among those who are sanctified by faith in me. Consequently, King Agrippa, I did not prove disobedient to the heavenly vision." See, Paul had to make a choice now. He met Jesus on the Damascus road, and now he has to make a choice. Either to obey him as Lord of Lords and King of Kings, the resurrected Lord, that now I realize I was wrong. I was killing the very people who are the branches in the vine. The vine is the true Son of God. All of those things are true. It was proven from Scripture to Saul, and now he witnesses the resurrected Lord in person. And so he said, I was not disobedient to the heavenly vision. He had a choice. He could have disobeyed. He could have turned aside, just like Judas did, but he didn't. By faith, he responded. Instead of being a persecutor of the church, he became the greatest proclaimer of Christianity, the greatest missionary the church has ever seen. His life turned around 180 degrees. Yes, a chosen vessel. But you see, those who are chosen are those who also choose. It's not enough for God to choose us. We have to choose him also. That's what Peter talks about in 2 Peter. Let me just read you a passage there. 2 Peter. He's talking here to Christians, and he goes on down and talks about all the blessings we have in chapter 1, verse 3, seeing that his divine power has granted to us everything pertaining to life and godliness through the true knowledge of him who called us by his own glory and excellence. He calls us, and we can become his chosen people. All right? But then notice what he says further. For by these things he has granted to us precious and magnificent promises, in order that by them you might become partakers of the divine nature, having escaped the corruption that is in the world by lust. Now for this very reason, applying all diligence in your faith, supply moral excellence. See, your faith, you supply moral excellence, or virtue, and in your moral excellence, knowledge, and in your knowledge, self-control, and in your self-control, perseverance, and in your perseverance, godliness, and in your godliness, brotherly kindness, and in your brotherly kindness, Christian love. For if these, notice it's conditional, if these qualities are yours and are increasing, they will render you neither useless nor unfruitful. If we grow and mature in Christ, and we develop and we experience the Christian graces, and our faith deepens and we grow and become more like Jesus, then we won't be useless. Like a grapevine is useless, not even good for a peg to hang a coat on. Doesn't have enough strength, you see, to stand out erect and hold up the cloak. You will neither be useless nor unfruitful. Judas became unfruitful. One of the chosen, one of the elect, became unfruitful. The Lord didn't want the rest of his disciples to become unfruitful, but they have to choose. And they have to respond. They have to yield their hearts and their lives to the Lord. And so that's what the Lord is telling these Christians here. You won't be useless or unfruitful in the true knowledge of our Lord Jesus Christ. For he who lacks these qualities is blind. That is, he closes his eyes, refuses to see, short-sighted, can't see beyond the end of his nose as far as the plans and purposes of life. He thinks that he's the center of the universe, and he cannot see beyond. No destiny, no purpose, no goal in life. Unable to see that the Lord has a plan and a purpose for life. And so he's blind, he's short-sighted, having forgotten his purification from his former sins. Therefore, brethren, be all the more diligent to make certain about his calling of us, and choosing you. That's election, the word elect again. His choosing of you. You see, we have to respond. And we have to ratify that election. God elects us, but then the question is, will we then choose to serve him and yield our lives to serve him? That's what Jesus is talking about in John 15. The branches that abide in the vine, and they draw their life and their hope and their destiny from him, they bring forth much fruit. Judas, in contrast, didn't do that. He turned away from Christ, lost his life, lost his soul, because he didn't ratify that election of the Lord. Let's close with a word of prayer. Father in heaven, we thank you so much that you are a God who is gracious, that you do take the initiative, that you call us, that long before we loved you, we know